Who made this meal? The black maid. Call her. What happens when a desperate chef accidentally serves a poison dish to the city's deadliest werewolf mafia boss? Let's find out. This is a sneak peek of my upcoming exclusive movie on my website, Married to the Most Feared Korean Mafia Boss. If you want to watch the full premium story the second it drops, click the link in the description or the pinned comment section to join the official Gumroad waitlist. Now, let's get into this. The 55th chef had left the estate in the back of an ambulance, and Nia was fairly certain she was about to be the 56th. She stood in the center of a kitchen that looked more like a surgical theater than a place to make food. It was all blinding stainless steel, imported marble, and a chilling, sterile emptiness. She had signed a 50-page non-disclosure agreement just to walk through the service elevators, pat-down included. She didn't know the name of the man who owned this sprawling Seoul penthouse. She only knew two things. The salary was exorbitant enough to wipe out her father's crushing gambling debts by the end of the month, and her employer was a man who demanded absolute, unquestioning perfection. The menu she had been handed dictated a delicate, crystal-clear French consomme. It was a dish that required patience, precision, and an utter lack of soul. Nia stared at the pristine stock simmering in front of her. She was a culinary school dropout, a girl who cooked by instinct and heart, not by rigid, bloodless rules. The coldness of the penthouse was creeping into her bones. She needed warmth. She needed fire. With a sudden, reckless snap of decision, Nia grabbed the printed menu and tossed it into the trash. She wasn't going to make a flavorless broth for a faceless billionaire. Moving with practiced grace, she raided the massive walk-in refrigerator. She pulled out thick cuts of bone in oxtail, fresh garlic, and root vegetables. From her own worn canvas bag, the only personal item security had allowed her to keep after thoroughly searching it, to pulled out two small, unlabeled glass jars. One held a vibrant red Korean gocharu. The other held her grandmother's secret African spice blend, a warm, earthy mixture of grains of paradise, smoked paprika, and wild herbs. For the next 2 hours, the sterile kitchen transformed. The air grew thick and heavy with the scent of searing meat and blooming spices. The broth bubbled, turning a rich, fiery mahogany. It was a slow, simmered, unapologetically spicy fusion of two worlds meant to stick to the ribs and warm the blood. It was defiance in a bowl. 2 floors up, Kang Minho sat at the head of a massive mahogany dining table. Minho was the alpha of the city's most feared Kakongpai syndicate, a predator draped in a bespoke Tom Ford suit. He was a man composed entirely of ice and paranoia. His wolf, a massive, dark beast that lurked just beneath his skin, was perpetually restless, pacing in the hollow emptiness of his chest. Trust was a liability he couldn't afford. He had fired 55 world-class chefs in the past year. Some were sent packing with hefty severance checks. Others were dragged out by his enforcers, left bleeding because Minho's heightened senses caught the faintest, suspicious metallic tang of poison in his food. He expected betrayal with every breath. He expected it with every bite. When the massive oak doors of the dining room swung open, his lead enforcer stepped in, carrying a covered silver tin. But even before the lid was lifted, Minho's nostrils flared. His wolf snapped to attention. This was not the delicate, odorless consommé he had ordered. The scent hitting the air was bold, heavy with heat, smoke, and an earthiness that made his canines lengthen slightly against his lower lip. The enforcer set the bowl down and removed the lid. A rich, spicy steam billowed upward. Instantly, the 4 guards stationed around the room reached inside their jackets, drawing their suppressed weapons. An unauthorized dish was a threat. A deviation from the menu was a potential assassination attempt. "Don't touch it, Alpha," the enforcer growled, his hand hovering over his holster. "I'll have the kitchen dealt with." The Minho stared down at the dark, simmering stew. Rage, cold and sharp, coiled in his gut. Another defiant chef. Another idiot who thought they knew better than the apex predator of soul. "Put your weapons away," Minho ordered, his voice a low, gray rumble that sent a shiver of absolute submission through the room. He didn't need them to protect him from a bowl of soup. He picked up the heavy silver spoon. He would take one bite. He would prove it was garbage, and then he would go downstairs and personally terrify whatever arrogant fool had dared to disobey him. He scooped up a piece of the tender meat and rich broth, lifting it to his lips. He took a bite. The reaction was instantaneous. The heat bloomed on his tongue, complex and fiery, melting the ice that had calcified in his chest for a decade. The depth of the flavor, the perfect, impossible marriage of familiar Korean spice and a rich, grounded earthiness he had never tasted before, hit him like a physical blow. It didn't taste like high-end restaurant food. It tasted like comfort. It tasted like a buried memory of a home he had never actually had. The spoon clattered against the expensive porcelain bowl. Minho closed his eyes, his chest heaving as a hot, unfamiliar shudder rolled through him. His wolf wasn't pacing anymore. It was completely still, captivated. He opened his eyes, and the icy, empty amber had bled into a glowing, luminescent gold. "Bring the chef to me," Minho commanded, his voice tight, rough with something that sounded dangerously like hunger. Now, down in the kitchen, Nia was wiping down the counter when the doors slammed open. 2 massive men in dark suits marched in. They didn't ask questions. They simply flanked her, their grips like iron vices, as they escorted her out of the kitchen and toward the private elevator. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The gambling debts, the ambulance, the 55th chef. The elevator doors parted, and they practically dragged her into a sprawling, dimly lit dining room. They shoved her forward, and she stumbled, catching her balance just in time to glare at the men before turning her attention to the head of the table. She expected an old, fat billionaire. Instead, she found herself staring into the most intense, arresting eyes she had ever seen. They were amber, flickering with a strange golden light. The man sitting there radiated power, danger, and a dark, predatory stillness that made the air in the room feel too thin to breathe. Nia didn't cower. She lifted her chin, squaring her shoulders. She was wearing a slightly stained chef's coat. Her dark hair was escaping its messy bun, and there was a distinct smudge of white flour on her left cheek. She looked entirely out of place in the opulent room, surrounded by armed men. Yet she stood there, defiant, staring the monster dead in the eye, completely unapologetic for the fire she had served him. Kang Minho looked at the flour on her cheek. He breathed in, catching the scent of the spices on her skin, mingled with the sudden, intoxicating spike of her adrenaline. His wolf roared to life, violently and irrevocably, claiming the space between them. The emptiness vanished, replaced in a split second by a consuming, scorching obsession. The silence in the dining room was absolute. A heavy, suffocating blanket that snuffed out the air in the room. For a prolonged, agonizing moment, the only sound was the frantic, erratic thrum of Nia's own heartbeat hammering against her ribs. She stood frozen, flanked by men whose tailored suits did nothing to hide the lethal bulge of shoulder holsters, staring at the man at the head of the table. His eyes were gold, not amber catching the light, not hazel. Gold, luminous, predatory, and entirely unhuman. Nia blinked, her rational mind frantically trying to dismiss what she had just seen as a trick of the dim atmospheric lighting. When he blinked, the eerie glow faded, retreating into a pair of dark, fathomless obsidian eyes that were utterly human, yet infinitely more terrifying. Kang Minho didn't break eye contact. He didn't look at his armed guards. He didn't look at the half-empty bowl of spicy, soul-warming oxtail stew resting in front of him. He only looked at her, his gaze sweeping over the messy bun, the flour on her cheek, the defiant set of her jaw. "What is your name?" His voice was a low, grolly vibration that seemed to travel through the floorboards and directly up her spine. "Nia," she snapped out, surprising herself with the steadiness of her tone. "Nia Barnes, and I was hired to cook, not to be hauled out of my kitchen like a criminal by your goons." A muscle feathered in Minho's jaw, the beast beneath his skin, the wolf that had been restless and feral for years, was suddenly violently anchored. The scent of her, a dizzying mix of toasted spices, adrenaline, and something inherently, intoxicatingly sweet, was hijacking his senses. "Mine," the wolf snarled. A primal possessive demand that shook the very foundations of Minho's ironclad control. He stood up. He was tall, intimidatingly so, moving with the fluid, silent grace of an apex predator. He rounded the table, stopping just a few feet from her. "You are no longer a hirer," Minho stated, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "You are not an employee who clocks in and out. You belong to this estate now. You will not leave ever." Nia let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "Excuse me. I think the hell not." I signed an NDA. "Mr. Whoever you are, not a contract for indentured servitude. I'm leaving right now." She turned on her heel, fully intending to march back to the kitchen, grab her canvas bag, and walk out the front door. "Take her phone. Take her ID," Minho commanded smoothly, not even raising his voice. "And lock down the penthouse elevators. Only I authorize access." Before Nia could even process the words, the two massive men beside her moved. One clamped a hand over her shoulder, holding her in place with terrifying ease, while the other smoothly reached into the pocket of her chef's coat, extracting her phone. "Hey, get your hands off me," Nia thrashed, twisting violently. But the man's grip was like forged steel. Panic, cold and sharp, finally began to pierce through her bravado. "You can't do this. This is kidnapping. You can't just keep me here." "I am Kang Minho," he said softly, stepping closer until he eclipsed her entire field of vision. The sheer proximity of him was overwhelming. He smelled of expensive cedar, cold night air, and something dangerously electric. "I can do whatever I please in this city. Your father, Arthur Barnes, owes the Black Lotus Casino 400 million yuan, a debt he was foolish enough to leverage his life against." Nia froze, the blood draining from her face. "I bought that debt 10 minutes ago," Minho lied seamlessly, though the intention was purely genuine. He would buy it the second she was out of his sight. He needed a chain to bind her, an anchor to keep her exactly where she was until he could figure out why his wolf was screaming that this human woman was its mate. "You are my personal chef now, Miss Barnes. You will cook for me and only me. In return, your father lives, but you do not cross the threshold of this penthouse. Do we understand each other?" "You're a monster," she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a sudden molten fury. "I am precisely what you need me to be," he murmured, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. "Show her to her quarters, the suite in the East Wing." They practically carried her out. Nia kicked, shouted, and swore, but the heavy oak doors of the East Wing suite closed behind her with a sickening, definitive click. The lock engaged. She was trapped. The room she had been thrown into was a masterpiece of modern luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, dizzying view of the Seoul skyline. The bed was massive, draped in Egyptian cotton. The adjoining bathroom was lined with imported Italian marble, but to Nia, it was nothing but a gilded cage. She spent the entire night pacing the length of the room, her mind racing. She was trapped in the viper's den. She had taken this secretive, high-paying job through a shadowy culinary agency, desperate to save her father from the ruthless, lone shark circling him. She hadn't known she was walking directly into the jaws of the most dangerous predator in the criminal underworld. Kang Min-ho, the Kang Pai boss, a man whose reputation for cold-blooded ruthlessness was whispered about even in the darkest corners of the city. And now she was his prisoner. When the morning sun finally broke over the skyline, casting long, pale shadows across the room, Nia had made a decision. She was not a victim. She was a survivor. She had survived culinary school in Paris with a target on her back. She had survived her father's destructive addiction, and she would survive Kang Min-ho. At 7 in the morning, the lock on her door clicked open. A guard stood in the hallway, gesturing for her to follow. She was escorted back to the sprawling, sterile kitchen. "The Alpha requires breakfast," the guard grunted, taking up a position by the service elevator. Nia looked at the pristine countertops, the gleaming pots and pans, and the fully stocked walk-in refrigerator. A slow, defiant smile curved her lips. "Does he?" She walked over to the expensive espresso machine, took her time grinding the beans, and pulled a perfect shot for herself. She found a loaf of fresh artisan bread, sliced off a thick piece, toasted it, and slathered it with expensive French butter. Then she hopped up onto the marble island, crossing her legs, and began to eat her breakfast in absolute, unapologetic silence. 30 minutes later, the kitchen doors swung open with enough force to shatter the hinges. Kang Min-ho strode into the room, dressed in dark trousers and a crisp, unbuttoned black dress shirt. The air in the room instantly grew heavy, the temperature dropping a few degrees. He took one look at the empty stove top, and then turned his dark, brooding gaze to Nia, who was leisurely sipping her espresso. "Where is my food?" he demanded, his voice a dangerous rumble. "I don't know. Did you look in the fridge?" Nia shot back, taking a deliberate bite of her toast. "I'm sure there's some leftover caviar in there you can snack on." Min-ho's eyes flashed, that terrifying golden light bleeding into the edges of his irises. "I gave you an order, and I gave you my resignation," Nia replied, swinging her legs lightly against the cabinets. "I don't cook for kidnappers. I don't cook for tyrants, and I certainly don't cook on command like some trained dog. You want to keep me locked up here? Fine, but you can't force me to pick up a knife or turn on a stove. So, unless you plan on starving, I suggest you fire up a delivery app." A low, guttural growl echoed in the kitchen. It was a sound that shouldn't have come from a human throat. The guard standing by the elevator instantly stiffened and lowered his eyes to the floor, terrified. In a fraction of a second, Minho closed the distance between them. He didn't just walk. He seemed to materialize right in front of her. Before Nia could even gasp, his hands slammed onto the marble countertop on either side of her thighs, caging her in. He leaned in, his face mere inches from hers. The sheer heat radiating off his body was staggering. It wasn't the warmth of a normal man. It was the blazing, barely contained heat of a furnace. "You like to play games?" he breathed, his voice a lethal caress against her skin. "You think because I spared you last night, because I found your little act of defiance amusing, that you hold some sort of power here." Nia's breath hitched. She couldn't move back. The edge of the counter was digging into her spine. The proximity was overwhelming. She could see the intricate, almost hypnotic pattern of gold swirling in his dark eyes. She could smell that intoxicating scent again. Cedar, spice, and raw, unfiltered masculinity. It made her head spin. It made her pulse race in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a sudden, terrifying biological response. I think Nia forced the words out, refusing to break eye contact, though her voice was an octave lower than normal. "That you're a bully who doesn't know how to handle someone saying no?" Minho leaned in a fraction of an inch closer. His gaze dropped to her throat, where her pulse was jumping wildly beneath her skin. His wolf was clawing at the inside of his chest, roaring at him to claim her, to bite down and mark her as his own. The urge was so overwhelming, so violently primal, that it took every ounce of his legendary willpower to keep his fangs from descending. "I could break you," he whispered, lifting a hand to brush a stray curl of dark hair away from her face. His knuckles grazed her cheek, the touch startlingly gentle, a devastating contrast to the lethal threat of his words. "I could strip everything away from you until you beg me to let you cook." Nia swallowed hard, a shiver violently racking her frame at his touch. The chemistry between them was a physical, tangible thing, a live wire snapping and sparking in the space between their bodies. It was magnetic. It was terrifying. "Do it then," she challenged, her voice a breathless whisper, but her chin remained tipped up in defiance. "Break me." For a long, agonizing moment, they remained locked in that hypercharged stalemate. Minho staring at her lips, Nia staring into his unnatural eyes, both of them breathing the same electrified air. Then, abruptly, Minho pushed himself away from the counter, turning his back on her as he took a sharp, ragged breath. He dragged a hand through his dark hair, the rigid tension in his shoulders betraying the monumental internal battle he was fighting. "Dinner is at 8, he stated, his voice stripped of all emotion, a cold, icy facade slamming back into place. "You will prepare a full-course meal. I have assigned a sous chef from my trusted staff to assist you. If the food is not on the table by 8 to 9, I will make a phone call and your father will lose his left hand." He didn't wait for her response. He simply walked out, the doors swinging shut behind him, leaving Naya sitting on the counter, her entire body trembling as she gasped for the air he had seemingly sucked out of the room by 6 months. That evening, the kitchen was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Nia had surrendered to the inevitable, but she was doing it on her own terms. If she was going to be a prisoner, she would be the undisputed queen of her cell. She was preparing a complex, multi-course menu that leaned heavily into the rich, bold flavors she excelled at. She needed the distraction. She needed the physical labor of chopping, searing, and seasoning to keep her mind off the terrifying reality of her captivity, and the even more terrifying reality of how her body had reacted to Kang Min-ho's touch. Her assigned sous chef was a young man named Beck. He was quiet, efficient, and never made eye contact. He moved around the kitchen like a shadow, fetching ingredients and preparing garnishes without a word. "Beck, I need the duck breast seared, skin side down, medium heat," Naya ordered, moving frantically between a bubbling reduction on the stove and a platter of roasted root vegetables. "Don't rush the fat rendering. I want it perfectly crisp." "Yes, chef," Beck murmured, stepping up to the stove. Nia moved to the center island to finish the plating for the appetizer, a delicate beef carpaccio with a citrus-infused panzu, microgreens, and shaved parmesan. It was an elegant dish, a concession to the high-end dining Min-ho was accustomed to, but she had elevated it with her own unique flavor profile. "Chef," Beck said softly, stepping away from the stove and approaching the island. He held a small, dark glass bottle in his gloved hand. "The Alpha prefers a drizzle of white truffle oil on his carpaccio." "It is a strict requirement," Nia frowned, looking up from the plates. She hated truffle oil. It was often synthetic, overpowering, and an insult to fresh ingredients. But she was already pushing her luck with Min-ho, and if a few drops of overpriced oil kept her father's appendages attached to his body, she would compromise. "Fine," Nia sighed, holding out her hand. "Give it here. I'll finish the plating." Beck hesitated for a fraction of a second before placing the bottle in her palm. "I can do it, chef." "You should tend to the duck," I said. "I'll do it," Nia replied sharply, her authority in the kitchen non-negotiable. She uncorked the small bottle. The scent hit her immediately, but it wasn't the earthy, pungent aroma of white truffles she expected. Beneath the heavy artificial mushroom scent was something else, something utterly wrong. It was faintly metallic, like the smell of a hot iron left on a board too long, layered with a harsh, bitter astringency. Nia's palate was her greatest weapon. It was sensitive to a near superhuman degree. She could identify a dozen spices in a blind taste test, and she could tell if a broth had been oversalted by a single grain. Frowning, she dipped the tip of her pinky finger onto the rim of the bottle, picking up a minuscule bead of the oil. She tapped it against her tongue. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. A sharp chemical burn seared across her taste buds. A bitter, agonizing numbness that immediately triggered her gag reflex. It tasted like death. It tasted like synthetic venom. Nia spat violently into the nearby sink, coughing as she frantically turned on the faucet and shoved her mouth under the rushing water, rinsing the microscopic trace of the toxin from her tongue. Her heart hammered against her ribs, ice water flooding her veins. Poison. She whipped around, her eyes wide with horror, looking for Bach. But the sous chef was gone, and the plated carpaccio dish that she had set aside for Minho was missing from the counter. No, Nia breathed, sheer panic seizing her chest. She didn't think. She didn't weigh the pros and cons of letting her monster of a captor die. Her legs moved entirely on instinct. She bolted out of the kitchen, sprinting down the long, heavily carpeted hallway toward the formal dining room. She burst through the heavy oak doors, just as Baek was setting the silver platter down in front of Kang Minho. Minho was already reaching for his fork, his golden-flecked eyes fixed on the perfectly plated meat. "Don't eat that," Nia screamed, her voice cracking as she vaulted over a decorative side table, her chef's coat flying behind her. Minho's head snapped up, surprise registering on his normally impassive face. Baek spun around, his eyes widening in panic, as he realized Nia was not dead on the kitchen floor, but charging like a bull. Nia didn't stop to explain. She didn't have time. She threw her entire body weight forward, launching herself across the last few feet of space and physically tackling Kang Minho out of his heavy oak chair. The impact was bone-jarring. Minho, caught entirely off guard by the sheer velocity of the small woman, went over backward. They crashed to the hardwood floor in a tangled heap of limbs, Nia landing heavily on top of his broad chest, knocking the wind out of him. Above them, the dining room erupted into utter chaos. Realizing he was caught, Baek didn't hesitate. He abandoned the poisoned food and reached into the waistband of his pristine white chef's trousers, pulling out a sleek, suppressed handgun. He aimed wildly at the floor where Minho had fallen. Flip, flip, flip. Bullets chewed into the heavy mahogany table and shattered the expensive china plates, raining ceramic shrapnel down onto Nia's back. Minho roared, a terrifying, booming sound that shook the chandelier above and rolled, pinning Nia securely beneath his massive frame to shield her from the gunfire. "Take him alive," Minho bellowed, his voice echoing with absolute authority. The 4 enforcers stationed in the corners of the room drew their weapons with lightning speed. The air was instantly thick with the smell of cordite and the deafening cracks of return fire. Baek, heavily outgunned, scrambled backward, firing blindly as he dove for the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, intending to shatter the glass and take his chances with the balcony. He didn't make it. 2 rounds caught him in the shoulder and thigh. He collapsed to the floor with a scream, his weapon skittering away across the polished wood. In seconds, 3 enforcers were on him, pinning him to the ground and zip-tying his wrists, brutally cutting off his screams. Silence, heavy and ringing, slammed back into the room. The only sound was the harsh, ragged breathing of the men and the tinkling of broken glass settling on the floor. Beneath Minho, Nia lay perfectly still, her eyes squeezed tightly shut, her heart beating so fast she thought it might actually burst through her sternum. She was trembling violently, her fingers curled into the fabric of Minho's expensive dress shirt. Slowly, Minho lifted himself up on his forearms, taking his crushing weight off her. He looked down at the woman pinned beneath him. Her face was pale, her dark hair a tangled mess across the floorboards. He looked at the shattered plate above them, remembering the smell of the truffle oil that had masked the faint, nearly undetectable scent of aconite, a poison designed specifically to bypass a wolf's enhanced senses until it was too late. Kang Minho, the ruthless, untouchable alpha of the syndicate, stared down at the human woman who had just fought him tooth and nail mere hours ago. She hated him. She was his captive, and she had just risked her own life to save his. The penthouse was a fortress sealed in titanium and glass. In the immediate aftermath of the gunfire, the sprawling estate transformed from a luxurious, sterile palace into a high-tech bunker. Steel shutters descended over the floor-to-ceiling windows, locking out the glittering Seoul skyline. The heavy oak doors were barred, and the number of armed enforcers patrolling the perimeters tripled. Kang Minho's orders were absolute, delivered in a voice that held the frigid, terrifying calm of a general at war. No one enters, no one leaves. And Beck, the traitorous sous chef, who had nearly succeeded in turning Minho's dining room into an assassination site, was dragged away, bleeding and broken to the soundproofed basement levels. For the first 24 hours, the air in the penthouse crackled with the residual electricity of violence. The scent of cordite lingered in the expensive drapery, a stark reminder of how close death had come. But as the lockdown stretched into its 3rd day, the atmosphere began to shift, thickening into something entirely different, something infinitely more dangerous than the threat of an unseen assassin. The battleground had shrunk. It was no longer a war between a criminal empire and its hidden enemies. It was a war of attrition, waged entirely within the sleek marble confines of the kitchen, between a ruthless syndicate boss and a defiant culinary dropout. Minho had refused to let Nia out of his sight, the rational, calculating part of his brain, the alpha who ruled the city's underworld with an iron fist, told him it was a matter of security. She was a liability. She was a witness. She was the only person who had ever detected the scent of aconite before it touched his lips. But the beast beneath his skin, The wolf that prowled relentlessly through his blood knew the truth. He couldn't let her go, because the very thought of distance tore at his chest. Instead of isolating her in the east wing, he moved his entire operation into the kitchen. Nia tried to ignore him. She turned the kitchen into her sanctuary, a frantic, highly structured world where she had absolute control. If she was going to be trapped in a gilded cage with a monster, she would at least command the territory. She cooked with a fierce, restless energy, her hands constantly moving, kneading, chopping, searing, and simmering. But it was impossible to ignore Kang Minho. He had taken over the massive 10-foot marble island in the center of the kitchen. He sat there in dark, tailored slacks and unbuttoned dress shirts, a command center of encrypted laptops, satellite phones, and thick dossier spread out before him. From that stool, he dismantled his enemies. Nia listened, her breath catching in her throat as he issued orders that decimated rival territories, liquidated assets, and condemned men to brutal, unforgiving fates. His voice was always low, growly, and entirely devoid of mercy. He was a tyrant, a warlord in a bespoke suit. Yet, when the phone calls ended and the screens went dark, the atmosphere in the kitchen fundamentally altered. The hostility that had defined their first meeting melted away, replaced by a suffocating, hyper-aware tension. A dangerous, predatory lust began to simmer in the space between them, thick and heavy as reducing syrup. Minho would watch her. He didn't try to hide it. As she moved between the stove top and the prep stations, his dark eyes would track her every movement. He watched the way her slender fingers expertly deboned a quail. He watched the stray curl of dark hair that constantly escaped her messy bun to rest against the nape of her neck. He watched the flush of heat rise on her cheeks as she leaned over a steaming pot. The golden, luminescent ring around his irises would flare, a silent, blazing testament to the feral hunger tearing at his control. And Nia, despite her best efforts, found herself watching him right back. She caught herself stealing glances at the broad, rigid lines of his shoulders when his back was turned. She noticed the dark smudges of exhaustion beneath his eyes, the way he rubbed his temple when a migraine threatened, the tightly coiled tension in his jaw that never seemed to fully release. The physical proximity was maddening. When she reached across the island to grab a bowl, the heat radiating from his skin was a physical shockwave. When he casually leaned over to inspect what she was chopping, the scent of cedar and raw, unfiltered masculinity made her heart kick against her ribs like a trapped bird. They were two apex predators circling each other in a cage, both acutely aware that it was only a matter of time before one of them gave in and bit. It happened on the 5th night of the lockdown. The clock on the stainless steel oven glowed in angry red. 2:14 a.m. The penthouse was tomb silent. The enforcers were stationed in the outer corridors, leaving the kitchen completely isolated. Nia couldn't sleep. The adrenaline, the captivity, and the maddening, intoxicating presence of Kang Minho had completely scrambled her nervous system. Desperate for a distraction, she had crept out of her suite and made her way to the kitchen. Comfort food was her only therapy. She wasn't making a delicate Michelin star creation. She was making something rustic, deeply personal, and universally healing. She had a heavy cast iron skillet on the burner, rendering down thick cubes of smoked pork belly. Beside it, a pot of hand-pulled noodles boiled rapidly in a rich, deeply savory, slow-simmered bone broth fortified with roasted garlic, charred scallions, and a heavy dose of gochujang. The kitchen smelled of smoke, salt, and home. She was at the counter, carefully slicing a soft-boiled egg in half, when a deep voice shattered the silence. "You're awake." Nia jumped, the knife slipping and clattering against the cutting board. She spun around, pressing her hand to her racing heart. Minho stood in the doorway. He looked entirely different from the impeccably dressed syndicate boss she observed during the day. He was barefoot, wearing a pair of soft, dark grey sweatpants that hung low on his narrow hips, and a fitted black t-shirt that stretched taut over the heavy musculature of his chest. His hair was tousled, falling into his eyes, giving him a dangerously boyish, vulnerable look that made Naya's breath hitch. "You startled me," she managed to say, turning back to the counter to hide the sudden, treacherous flush climbing up her neck. "I couldn't sleep." "Neither could I," he murmured. He walked slowly into the kitchen, the utter silence of his bare feet on the marble unnerving. He bypassed his makeshift command center and walked straight to the liquor cabinet. He pulled down a bottle of vintage single malt scotch and poured a generous measure into a heavy crystal tumbler. He turned and leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip, his eyes heavy and unreadable as they fixed on her. "What are you making?" "Noodles, pork belly, broth," Naya said shortly, aggressively chopping a scallion. "It's not on the approved dietary list your security team gave me." "I don't care about the list," he said softly. The exhaustion in his voice was profound. It wasn't just physical fatigue. It was the soul-deep weariness of a man who had carried the weight of a violent empire for too long. Nia stopped chopping. She looked at him, really looked at him, and the anger that usually fueled her interactions with him suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying, aching empathy. He looked so incredibly tired. Without a word, she reached for a second, deep ceramic bowl. She divided the rich, dark broth, the noodles, the crispy pork belly, and the soft-boiled egg between the two bowls. She garnished them with the scallions and carried them over to the kitchen island. She set one down in front of him, sliding a pair of wooden chopsticks next to it. Then she took her own bowl, walked around the island, and sat on the stool directly beside him, not across from him, beside him. Minho stared at the bowl. He stared at the steam rising from the dark, spicy broth. For a long moment, he didn't move. His hand tightened around his crystal tumbler until his knuckles turned bone white. "It's not poisoned," Nia said gently, picking up her own chopsticks. "I promise." Minho closed his eyes, a ragged, uneven breath escaping his lips. "I know it isn't. If you wanted me dead, you would have let Bake finish the job." He opened his eyes, the amber irises turning to look at her. "Why didn't you, Nia?" It was the first time he had used her name. The sound of it, spoken in that low, growly vibration, sent a shock wave of heat straight to her core. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the absolute truth. I saw the tray. I tasted the oil, and my body moved before my brain could tell me how stupid it was to save the man who kidnapped me. A ghost of a smile, sad and incredibly bitter, touched the corner of his mouth. He set the whiskey down and picked up the chopsticks. He took a bite of the noodles and the pork. Nia watched as his shoulders slowly, fractionally dropped. The tension that permanently gripped his spine eased just a fraction of an inch. The food was warm, heavy, and brutally honest. It was exactly what he needed. "I fired 55 chefs in the last 12 months, Minho said quietly, his gaze fixed on the dark broth in his bowl. The silence of the kitchen wrapped around them, intimate and heavy. "Before you, my enforcers thought I was losing my mind. They thought the Alpha was succumbing to the paranoia that plagues all old Kangpai bosses. I threw plates against the wall. I sent men to the hospital because the soup tasted too metallic, or the meat smelled too sweet." He paused, taking a slow sip of the scotch. The golden light in his eyes flickered, deeply buried beneath a well of ancient, agonizing grief. "When I was 10 years old," he continued, his voice dropping into a hollow, deadened register, "my father hosted a banquet. He was brokering a peace treaty with a rival faction, the Russian Bratva. It was supposed to be a celebration. The dining room was filled with flowers, music, and the most expensive food in the city." Nia stopped eating. She turned on her stool, her entire focus zeroed in on the man beside her. The air in the room had grown perfectly still. "My mother was beautiful," Minho murmured, staring at a spot on the marble counter that wasn't there. She hated the life, hated the syndicate, but she loved my father, and she loved me. She was sitting right beside me. The servers brought out the main course, a delicate braised fish in a white wine reduction. She took the first bite. Nia's stomach plummeted. "Minho," she breathed, the honorific completely forgotten. "It was a specialized neurotoxin," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm, devoid of all emotion. "It was the practiced association of a man who had survived unimaginable trauma. Odorless, tasteless. The Brava had paid off the head chef. It only took 30 seconds. She dropped her fork. She grabbed her throat. She couldn't breathe. I was 10 years old, Nia. I sat there in my little tuxedo, holding her hand, while she choked on her own blood and died on the dining room floor. A suffocating, agonizing silence descended on the kitchen. Nia felt the sudden, sharp sting of tears burning the back of her eyes. My father slaughtered everyone in the room, Minho stated, a dark, feral edge creeping back into his voice. He killed the rivals. He killed the servers. He killed the chef. But it didn't bring her back, and from that day on, every plate of food placed in front of me looked like a loaded gun. He turned to look at her, the golden ring in his eyes burning with a fierce, naked vulnerability that made Nia's breath catch. Food became my greatest fear. It became a weapon, he whispered, leaning in just a fraction of an inch, the agonizing proximity pulling at her like gravity. I lived in a state of constant, suffocating starvation. Even when I ate, I was waiting to die, waiting for the burn in my throat. The beast inside me was starving, rabid with paranoia. He reached out slowly, deliberately, as if expecting her to flinch away. When she didn't, his large, calloused hand cupped the side of her face. His thumb gently brushed the line of her cheekbone. His touch was a scorching brand, setting fire to every nerve ending in her body. Until you, he breathed, his gaze dropping to her lips. You walked into my kitchen, defied every order I gave you, and served me a bowl of fire. And for the first time in 20 years, I wasn't afraid. For the first time in 20 years, I felt warm. Mia's heart slammed against her ribs in a frantic, deafening rhythm. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't look away. The terrifying, ruthless syndicate boss was gone. In his place was a broken, lethal man who was looking at her as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. And in that singular, agonizingly perfect moment, Nia realized the terrifying truth. The Stockholm Syndrome hadn't set in. It was something far worse, far more permanent. She was falling in love with him. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut as the space between them vanished. She could feel the erratic puff of his breath against her lips. She could feel the violent, barely restrained tremor in his hand. He was going to kiss her. He was going to kiss her, and it was going to ruin her completely. The harsh, violent vibration of a cell phone shattered the silence like a gunshot. Minho instantly stiffened, the vulnerability vanishing in a microsecond as his military-grade instincts kicked in. His hand dropped from her face, his eyes snapping back to their icy obsidian emptiness. He turned, scanning the counter, looking for one of his encrypted satellite phones. But it wasn't his phone. The sound was coming from a small, sealed crate of organic root vegetables sitting by the sink. a delivery that had been thoroughly vetted and cleared by security just hours ago. Nia frowned, a cold spike of dread piercing through the lingering haze of lust. She stood up, walking over to the crate. She pushed aside a layer of soil-covered potatoes. Buried at the bottom, wrapped in thin plastic, was a cheap disposable burner phone. It was vibrating aggressively. She picked it up. The screen displayed an unknown number. "Don't answer it," Minho commanded, his voice sharp, taking it a step toward her. His instincts were screaming that the perimeter had been breached. Not physically, but fundamentally. But Nia's was already swiping across the cracked screen. She brought the phone to her ear. "Hello," she whispered, her voice trembling. For a second, there was only the sound of heavy, static-filled breathing. Then a voice spoke. It was thick, dripping with a heavy Russian accent, and completely devoid of humanity. "Little chef," the man sneered. "You ruined a very expensive investment of ours when you tackled the Kang dog. We are very displeased." Nia's blood ran ice cold. She looked up, meeting Minho's dark, questioning gaze. "Who is this?" she demanded, panic rising in her throat. "Check your messages, little chef." The line went dead. Nia pulled the phone away from her ear with a shaking hand. A notification popped up on the screen. It was a multimedia message. She tapped it open. A choked, horrified gasp ripped from her throat. The burner phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the marble floor. It was a picture of her father. Arthur Barnes was tied to a metal chair in a dark concrete room. His face was a brutalized, unrecognizable mask of blood and purple bruises. One of his eyes was swollen completely shut. Standing behind him, holding a massive serrated hunting knife to his throat, was a man with a heavy ink-black tattoo of a double-headed eagle on his forearm, the mark of the Russian Bratva. Minho crossed the kitchen in a heartbeat. He picked up the phone, looking at the screen. The temperature in the kitchen plummeted to freezing. The wolf inside him snarled, a violent, bloodthirsty sound that seemed to echo in the room. The screen pinged again. A text message followed the photo. Minho read it aloud, his voice devoid of all inflection. A chilling harbinger of absolute carnage. "He owes us 400 million won. You took our inside man. Now you will finish the job. You have 48 hours to poison Kang Minho. If he is not dead by Sunday morning, we will mail your father back to you, piece by piece." Nia fell back against the counter, her hands flying up to cover her mouth to stifle the sob clawing at her throat. The beautiful, fragile truce they had just built shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The Bratva had found her. They had her father. She stared at the man she had just realized she loved. The devastating, impossible choice crushing the breath out of her lungs. To save her father, she had to become the monster Kang Minho had spent his entire life running from. She had to become his executioner. The ticking of the brushed steel wall clock in the kitchen sounded less like a mechanism and more like the swing of an executioner's axe. Tick, tick, tick. It had been 36 agonizing, suffocating hours since the burner phone had shattered the fragile, beautiful truce Nia had built with the most dangerous man in Seoul. 36 hours since she had seen the photograph of her father, battered and blooded, held at the mercy of the Russian Brata. Piece by piece, the threat echoed in her skull, a relentless, sickening mantra that had stolen her sleep, her appetite, and very nearly her sanity. Now it was Friday evening. She had less than 12 hours left to comply with the Brata's demands. The small, innocuous-looking glass vial of clear liquid smuggled into the penthouse that morning inside a hollowed-out truffle from a compromised vendor felt heavier than a lead weight in the deep pocket of her white chef's apron. It was odorless. It was tasteless. It was guaranteed to stop a man's heart in under 60 seconds, mimicking a massive, untraceable cardiac arrest. It was the instrument of her damnation. Nia stood over the sprawling marble island, her hands moving with a frantic mechanical precision that belied the absolute devastation tearing her apart inside. She was preparing a lavish multi-course meal, pouring every ounce of her culinary genius into what she knew with sickening certainty would be Kang Min-ho's last supper. She had chosen to make Galbi Jim braised beef short ribs. It was a dish of immense comfort and patience. She had spent the entire afternoon slowly rendering the fat, simmering the bone-in meat, in a rich, dark, sweet, savory reduction of aged soy, mirin, Asian pear, and toasted sesame. The scent filling the kitchen was intoxicating, heavy with garlic, ginger, and a deep caramelized warmth. Tears prickled the back of her eyes, hot and sharp, blurring her vision as she meticulously arranged wild mushrooms and carved carrots around the tender meat in a heavy heated ceramic serving bowl. Arthur Barnes was a deeply flawed man. He was a compulsive gambler, a liar, and a coward who had mortgaged his only daughter's future to feed an addiction he refused to fight. He had left her drowning in debt. He had failed her in almost every way a father could fail a child. But he was still her father. He was the man who had taught her how to ride a bicycle on the cracked pavements of their old neighborhood. He was the man who had held her hand and wept with her when her mother had died. Could she let him be butchered? Could she live with the knowledge that he had been tortured to death in some damp concrete basement because she had refused to pull the trigger? Her hand slipped into the pocket of her apron, her trembling fingers brushing against the cold, smooth glass of the vial. To save Arthur, she had to murder Kang Min-ho. She had to take the life of the man who had bared his soul to her in the dead of night, the man whose touch had ignited a fire in her blood so fierce It terrified her. The man who, despite his legendary ruthlessness, had shielded her body with his own when the bullets started flying. She was trapped in a nightmare where every exit led to hell. It smells incredible. Nia gasped, her hand jerking out of her pocket as she spun around. Minho stood in the archway of the kitchen. He had just emerged from his private quarters, freshly showered. His dark hair was still slightly damp, curling at the ends, and he was dressed down in a pair of dark slacks and a soft charcoal grey cashmere sweater that emphasized the broad, heavily muscled lines of his chest and shoulders. But it wasn't his devastating good looks that made the breath completely vanish from Nia's lungs. It was his eyes. The icy obsidian emptiness that usually defined the Kung Kangpe boss was completely gone. The terrifying feral gold of his wolf was muted. Instead, he looked at her with a soft, profound warmth. It was a look of total, unadulterated trust. It was the look of a man who had spent 2 decades waiting in the dark, paranoid and starving, who had finally found a fire he could sit beside without fear of being burned. He had dismissed his enforcers to the outer perimeter of the penthouse. He had locked down the wing for the first time since she had arrived. They were completely, utterly alone. He had given her his back. He had given her his life. "You're working too hard," Minho murmured. Stepping fully into the kitchen, he crossed the marble floor with that silent, predatory grace. Coming to a stop just inches from her, he reached out, his large, calloused hand gently tucking a stray curl of hair behind her ear. His knuckles brushed against her cheek, his skin radiating that furnace-like heat she had become so dangerously addicted to. "You look pale, Nayo Simjang." My heart. The Korean endearment slipped from his lips so naturally, so fiercely possessive, that it felt like a physical blow to Nia's chest. She swallowed hard, desperately fighting the urge to lean into his touch, to bury her face in his chest and scream for help. But the brave had eyes everywhere. They had breached the penthouse once. If she breathed a word of the blackmail, Minho would wage war, and her father would be executed before the first shot was fired. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice cracking slightly. She forced a fragile, trembling smile, the heat from the stove. It's a complicated dish, Tom." Minho's gaze lingered on her face, tracing the delicate lines of her features. He didn't push. He simply lowered his head, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. "Come, let's eat. I want to taste what you've spent all day creating." He turned and walked toward the small, intimate dining alcove, tucked into the corner of the massive kitchen, taking a seat at the heavy oak table. Nia stood frozen at the counter. The ceramic bowl of braised ribs steamed in front of her. "Do it!" A desperate, frantic voice in her head screamed. "Pour it in. Mix it. Serve it. Save your father. Walk away." Her hand shook violently as she reached into her apron. She pulled out the small glass vial. She popped the tiny cork. She stared at the rich, dark reduction coating the perfectly cooked beef. It would blend seamlessly. He would never smell it. The aconite had failed because it had a trace metallic scent. This was Bratva engineered. It was a ghost. With a sob lodged sideways in her throat, choking off her air, Nia tilted the vial. 3 clear drops fell from the glass lip, sinking into the hot, bubbling sauce, vanishing without a trace. She quickly recorked the vial and shoved it back into her pocket. She picked up the heavy ceramic bowl and a pair of silver serving tongs, her legs feeling like lead as she walked the 20 piatwat to the alcove. Minho was pouring a deep, full-bodied red wine into 2 crystal glasses. He looked up as she approached, the tension completely absent from his frame. Nia set the bowl down in the center of the table. She served a bed of perfectly steamed short-grain rice onto his plate. And then, with hands that trembled so badly the silver tongs clattered against the ceramic, she placed a large, tender piece of the poisoned beef directly on top of the rice, spooning the lethal dark sauce over it. She sat down opposite him, her hands dropping to her lap, her fingers twisting into the fabric of her apron until her knuckles ached. "You aren't eating?" Minho asked, noting her empty plate. I tasted it as I cooked." "I'm full," she whispered, her eyes glued to his hands. Minho smiled. It was a rare, beautiful thing that transformed his harsh, ruthless features into something breathtaking. "Then you can drink," he said, pushing a glass of the red wine toward her. He picked up his heavy silver fork. Time seemed to instantly dilate, slowing to a thick, viscous crawl. Nia could hear the blood roaring in her own ears, a deafening waterfall of panic and grief. Minho pressed the edge of the fork into the beef. It yielded effortlessly, falling apart at the touch. He gathered a piece of the meat coated in the dark, glistening sauce and lifted it toward his mouth. Nia watched the fork rise. She saw the absolute lack of hesitation in his movements. After watching his mother die, after 20 years of meticulously inspecting every ounce of food that entered his atmosphere, he was blindly, implicitly trusting her. He was handing her the knife and baring his chest, completely confident she would never strike. The fork reached his lips, his mouth opened. No, the word didn't form in her brain. It exploded from her soul. "No!" Nia screamed, the sound tearing from her throat in a raw, animalistic shriek. She didn't think. She lunged across the small table, throwing her entire upper body over the plates. Her hand slammed into Minho's wrist with all the strength she possessed. The impact was violent. The silver fork flew from his grip, sailing across the room. Minho's hand jerked, and the heavy ceramic plate flipped, launching the poisoned meat and rice into the air. It crashed onto the marble floor, the plate shattering into 100 jagged, razor-sharp pieces, the dark sauce splattering violently across the pristine white stone like a spray of arterial blood. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening, and terrifying. For 3 agonizing seconds, neither of them moved. Nia lay half-sprawled across the oak table, her chest heaving, a hysterical, broken sob tearing from her lips. She had done it. She had saved him. And in doing so, she had just signed her own father's death warrant. Across the table, the shift in Kang Min-ho was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The soft, trusting man vanished, vaporized in a microsecond. In his place was the Alpha, the warlord, the beast who had survived a lifetime of betrayal and assassination attempts. His eyes didn't just turn gold, they burned, blazing with a feral demonic fury. The temperature in the kitchen plummeted to a glacial, bone-chilling 0. The air crackled with a lethal, suffocating pressure. Min-ho moved faster than the human eye could track. Before Nia could even push herself back off the table, his hand shot out, his long, powerful fingers wrapping around her throat. He didn't squeeze, he didn't crush her windpipe, but the grip was an iron vice, a terrifying display of absolute dominance. He hauled her over the table, plates and wine glasses crashing to the floor, and slammed her back against the nearest wall. The breath was knocked from her lungs. She gasped, staring wide-eyed into the face of a monster. His free hand moved in a blur. The metallic shing of a weapon clearing its holster rang out, and in the next fraction of a second, the cold, unforgiving steel of a 9mm pistol was pressed directly flush under the soft flesh of her chin, forcing her head up. "Who?" Min-ho roared, the sound vibrating with such concussive force it rattled the heavy pots hanging over the island. His chest heaved. His fangs visibly descended against his lower lip. The paranoia, the ancient, deep-seated trauma of the poison banquet table had violently reasserted itself. He had let his guard down. He had trusted, and he had been served death. "Tell me who bought you, or I will paint this wall with your brains right now." Tears streamed down Nia's face, hot and fast, tracking over the flour dust, still clinging to her cheek. She didn't fight him. She didn't struggle against the hand at her throat or the gun under her chin. Her hands came up not to strike him, but to desperately grip the lapels of his cashmere sweater, holding on to him as the world collapsed around her. "The bratva," she sobbed, the words tumbling out in a frantic, broken rush. The Russians, they sent a phone in the vegetables. "They have him, Min-ho. They have my father." Min-ho's jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped beneath his skin. The gun dug a fraction of an inch harder into her jawline. "And you chose to execute me to save the degenerate who sold you to a casino?" His voice was a lethal, freezing whisper, dripping with a betrayal so profound it felt like an open wound. "I tried," Nia cried out, her voice breaking, the absolute agony of her choice laying her completely bare. She looked directly into his blazing, terrifying eyes, refusing to flinch away from his wrath. I tried to do it. I put the drops in the sauce. I walked over here to watch you die. She choked on a sob, her fingers curling tighter into his sweater, pulling him closer to her breaking heart. But I couldn't, she screamed, the truth ripping out of her. I couldn't do it. I knocked the plate away. I chose you. I chose you, and now they're going to cut him to pieces, and it's my fault. Please, Minho, kill me. Just pull the trigger and kill me. But please, please don't let them hurt him. The words hung in the freezing air, raw and bleeding. Minho stared down at her. He saw the absolute, unfiltered terror in her wide, tear-filled eyes. But beneath the terror, he saw the devastating truth. She hadn't failed to poison him. She had chosen to save him. In the final decisive moment, with her father's life on the line, she had shattered the plate. She had chosen the monster over her own blood. The wolf inside Minho, which had been thrashing in a blind, violent rage of betrayal, suddenly went completely still. The paranoia that had defined his existence evaporated, burned away by the blinding, blinding realization that he was loved. Unconditionally, dangerously, the beast didn't want her blood. It wanted to protect its mate. Slowly, the golden fire in Minho's eyes receded, replaced by an obsidian darkness so deep and cold, it promised absolute annihilation to anyone who dared touch what was his. He dropped his arm. The gun lowered, the cold steel leaving her skin. He released her throat, his large hands sliding up to cup her face, his thumb violently wiping away the tears tracking down her cheeks. He pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face in her dark hair, inhaling the scent of her fear and her loyalty. I am not going to kill you. Minho breathed his voice, a dark, growly promise that sent shivers racing down her spine. And they are not going to touch him. He pulled back, his eyes locking onto hers. The syndicate boss had fully returned, cold, calculating, and lethally precise. Where is the phone? Nia pointed a trembling finger toward the kitchen counter. Minho moved. He grabbed the burner phone, bypassing the lock screen, and immediately tapped into the device's metadata using an encrypted app on his own satellite phone. He didn't need to call them. He didn't need to negotiate. He just needed the GPS ping from their last message. Within 30 seconds, the coordinates locked onto his screen. An abandoned shipyard warehouse on the southern docks of Inchan. Minho pressed a button on his earpiece. The command he issued was not a request. It was a declaration of war. Activate the Reaper Protocol, Minho ordered, his voice echoing in the silent kitchen with chilling authority. Mobilize all inner circle enforcers. heavy artillery, suppressed weapons. Target is a brought stronghold at the Enchan docks. I want a perimeter established in 20 minutes. No one gets out. No one breathes unless I permit it. He turned back to Nia. He walked over to her, taking her trembling face in both of his hands. He pressed a hard, bruising, fiercely possessive kiss to her mouth, claiming her entirely. "Lock the doors," he whispered against her lips. "Not open them for anyone but me. I am going to bring him back to you." He didn't wait for her to reply. Kang Min-ho turned and strode out of the kitchen, holstering his weapon. He was no longer a man. He was a force of nature, an apex predator unleashed, and hell was coming with him. The rain began to fall just as the convoy of black-armored SUVs killed their headlights, rolling to a silent, synchronized stop on the slick, oil-stained concrete of the Incheon docks. The massive, rusted, corrugated metal warehouse sat at the end of Pier 4, isolated and dark, save for the faint yellow glow spilling from high frosted windows. The Brata thought they were untouchable. They thought they had backed the Kakongpai boss into a corner using a civilian chef. They had made a fatal miscalculation. Kang Min-ho stepped out of the lead vehicle. The rain instantly soaked his dark hair, plastering it to his forehead. He had shed the cashmere sweater, wearing a tactical Kevlar vest over a black long-sleeve shirt. In his hands, he held a suppressed, short-barreled Sigmax assault rifle. His eyes were glowing a brilliant, unearthly gold in the darkness. 30 heavily armed enforcers materialized from the shadows around him, moving with the silent, lethal precision of a highly trained paramilitary unit. Min-ho didn't give a speech. He didn't waste time on tactics. He simply raised 2 fingers and pointed at the steel blast doors of the warehouse. Breach. The assault was a masterclass in beautifully orchestrated violence. Charges blew the hinges of the heavy steel doors, the suppressed thump barely echoing over the crashing rain and the rolling thunder. Before the smoke could even clear, Min-ho was inside. A dark, terrifying phantom moving through the gloom. The warehouse was a labyrinth of shipping crates and rusted machinery. The Russian guards, arrogant and unprepared, barely had time to reach for their weapons before the Kongpai enforcers cut them down. Thip, flip, thip. Suppressed gunfire chewed through the air. Bodies dropped to the concrete, blood pooling in the damp, freezing shadows. Min-ho didn't break stride. He moved with a brutal mechanical efficiency, his rifle barking twice for every target that presented itself in his peripheral vision. He was a reaper, rushing through the ranks of the men who had dared to threaten the woman he loved. He reached the center of the warehouse, kicking open the door to a reinforced glass and steel foreman's office. Inside, Arthur Barnes was strapped to a metal chair, unconscious, his face a swollen, unrecognizable mass of purple bruises and dried blood. Standing over him was the Brata lieutenant, the man with the double-headed eagle tattoo, his eyes wide with sudden, dawning terror as he realized his fortress had fallen in less than 3 minutes. The Russian went for the heavy Glock on his hip. Minho didn't even raise his rifle. He dropped it, letting it hang on its tactical sling, and drew the combat knife from his chest rig in one fluid, lightning-fast motion. He crossed the room before the Russian could clear leather, driving the 6-in steel blade up under the man's rib cage, piercing the heart with surgical precision. He leaned in close, twisting the blade, his golden eyes locking onto the dying man's terrified gaze. "You touched what is mine," Minho whispered, his voice a demonic rumble in the small room. "And I leave no survivors." He ripped the blade free. The Russian collapsed dead before he hit the floor. Minho wiped the blade on the dead man's jacket, sheathed it, and turned his attention to the unconscious figure in the chair. He pulled a folding knife from his pocket and sliced through the heavy zip ties binding Arthur's wrists and ankles. The older man slumped forward, groaning in pain. Minho caught him, effortlessly hauling Arthur's dead weight over his broad shoulder. He stepped out of the office. The warehouse was completely silent. Dozens of Brata bodies littered the concrete floor. Not a single breath remained in the building that didn't belong to the Kong Pai. "Burn it," Minho ordered his lead enforcer as he walked toward the exit, carrying Naya's father out into the cleansing torrential rain. Burn it to the ground. Let the ash wash into the sea. He had made his choice. He had unleashed his wrath, and now he was going home to his mate. The storm that battered Seoul that night was a deluge of biblical proportions, turning the city's glittering skyline into a blurred, weeping smear of neon and shadows. Inside the fortified penthouse, the silence was a living, breathing entity, thick and suffocating. Nia stood perfectly still in the center of the kitchen. She hadn't moved for what felt like hours. She hadn't even attempted to clean up the chaos. The shattered remnants of the heavy ceramic plate lay scattered across the pristine white marble floor. The dark, lethal source of the poisoned Galbi gym smeared like a gruesome Rorschach test. The rich, savory scent of roasted sesame and braised beef still hung heavily in the air, mocking the absolute devastation that had unfolded only hours before. She was waiting. She could have run. The enforcers guarding the outer perimeter of the penthouse would not have stopped her. Minho had given them no orders to detain her. She could have packed her canvas bag, taken the service elevator down to the lobby, and disappeared into the torrential rain, leaving the mafia, the wolves, and the madness far behind. But her feet remained rooted to the hardwood floor. At precisely 3:14 a.m., the heavy brushed steel doors of the private elevator chimed. The sound shattered the silence like a gunshot. Nia's breath hitched, her hands flying to her mouth as the doors parted. Kang Minho stepped into the foyer, He was a terrifying, magnificent vision of absolute carnage. The torrential rain had soaked him to the bone, plastering his dark hair flat against his forehead. The black tactical Kevlar vest he wore was ripped, smeared with grease, ash, and a staggering amount of blood. His face was pale, his jaw set in a rigid line of agonizing tension. But his eyes, those nearly luminous golden eyes, found her immediately. He didn't walk. He stalked into the kitchen, leaning heavily against the door frame, as a violent shudder racked his massive frame. He was bleeding profusely. A dark, wet, crimson stain was spreading rapidly across the left side of his ribs, soaking through his black, long-sleeved shirt and dripping onto the floorboards, mixing with the rainwater, pooling at his combat boots. Minho, Nia breathed, the Yao name tearing from her throat in a ragged gasp. She rushed forward, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. "He is safe," Minho rasped. His voice, a low, grolly vibration that sounded like two stones grinding together. He caught her shoulders to steady himself, his large hands leaving bloody imprints on her white chef's coat. My men intercepted the Brata's transport vehicle. Arthur is in a secure medical facility under syndicate protection. The injuries are severe, but not fatal. By tomorrow night, he will be on a private jet to Zurich with a new passport, a new name, and enough capital to ensure he never sees the inside of a casino again. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief broke from Naya's chest. He had done it. He had walked into the fires of hell and pulled her father out just as he had promised. "The Brata," she whispered, her eyes wide as she looked at the blood coating his hands. "Erased," Minho stated, a dark, feral satisfaction flickering in his golden eyes. "They no longer exist on this peninsula." He took a step forward, intending to walk past her toward his quarters, but his left leg buckled. A low, guttural groan tore from his throat as he pitched forward. Nia caught him. She braced her small frame against his massive, muscular weight, her arms wrapping around his waist as he heavily leaned into her. The heat radiating off his body was staggering. A blazing furnace fueled by adrenaline, violence, and the accelerated healing of his wolf, trying to combat a massive trauma. "You're shot," she cried out, feeling the hot, slick wetness soaking through his shirt. A ricochet and a blade. He grunted, his breath hot and ragged against her ear. "The healing factor will handle it. Just get me to a chair." "No, we aren't going to a chair. And we aren't waiting for magic wolf blood to fix a severed artery," Naya commanded, her voice suddenly stripping away all the fear, replaced by the ironclad authority of a woman who ran a high-pressure kitchen. She supported his weight, half carrying, half dragging the most feared mafia boss in Seoul toward the massive 10-foot marble kitchen island. "Up," she ordered. Minho looked at her, his golden eyes flashing with a mix of pain and dark amusement. With a monumental effort, he hoisted himself up onto the cool marble surface. He sat on the edge of the island, his legs dangling, his head falling back as he fought to draw a breath through the agonizing pain in his ribs. Nia didn't hesitate. She flew to the stainless steel cabinets, ripping open the drawers until she found the heavy military trauma kit Minho's enforcers kept stocked. She sprinted back to the island, snapping on a pair of black nitro gloves. "Take the vest off," she ordered, her hands already reaching for a pair of trauma shears. Minho fumbled with the heavy Velcro straps, his fingers slick with his own blood. With a frustrated growl, Nia swatted his hands away. She grabbed the straps, ripping them free with a sharp, violent motion, and tossed the heavy Kevlar vest onto the floor. Next came the ruined black shirt. She didn't bother trying to pull it over his head. She took the shears and cut straight up the center, peeling the blood-soaked fabric away from his skin to bare his torso. Nia's breath caught in her throat. His chest and stomach were a landscape of hard, rigidly defined muscle, but they were also a map of violence. Pale, silvery scars crisscrossed his skin, remnants of a lifetime spent fighting for survival in the criminal underworld. But her focus immediately locked onto the fresh, gaping wound on his left side. A high-caliber bullet had grazed his ribs, tearing away a deep channel of flesh, and just beneath it was a vicious, jagged knife slash that was bleeding freely. "Hold still," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she grabbed a bottle of surgical antiseptic and a stack of heavy gauze pads. "It's going to burn," Minho warned, his jaw clenching. "I know," she replied softly. She poured the antiseptic directly into the wounds. Minho threw his head back, a terrifying animalistic roar tearing from his throat as the chemical fire bit into his raw flesh. His hands clamped down on the edge of the marble island with enough force to crack the stone. His fangs descended, sharp and lethal against his lower lip, and the beast beneath his skin thrashed wildly in agony. But Nia didn't flinch. She didn't back away. She pressed the heavy gauze firmly into the knife wound, applying brutal, necessary pressure to stop the arterial bleeding. For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sounds in the kitchen were the relentless pounding of the rain against the glass, the ragged, heavy breathing of the alpha, and the soft, determined whispers of the woman saving his life. Nia worked with the same frantic, meticulous precision she used when plating a delicate dish. She cleaned the wounds, applied surgical glue to the bullet graze, and expertly, butterfly, stitched the knife slash, finishing by wrapping his broad torso tightly in heavy white bandages. When she finally secured the medical tape, she stepped back, stripping off the bloody nitro gloves and tossing them onto the counter. She was breathing hard, her own adrenaline beginning to crash. "It's done," she whispered, her eyes meeting his. Minho was staring at her. The pain in his expression had receded, replaced by something infinitely more dangerous. The golden fire in his eyes was blinding, burning with a feral, possessive intensity that made the air in the kitchen feel impossibly thin. He looked at her standing there in the ruins of the kitchen. Her white chef's coat was smeared with his blood. Her dark hair had completely escaped its messy bun, falling in wild, beautiful tangles around her shoulders. She was surrounded by the shattered plates of their violent past, breathing in the scent of rain, copper, and spices. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't looking at him with the horror and revulsion he was so accustomed to seeing in the eyes of outsiders. She was looking at him with a dark, consuming hunger that perfectly mirrored his own. "You didn't run," Minho stated, his voice dropping into a low, rumbling octave that vibrated straight through Naya's core. "No," she breathed, stepping closer to the island, unable to fight the gravitational pull of him any longer. "I didn't. You know what I am now, Nia," he whispered, his large hands reaching out to grip her waist, pulling her flush against the V of his spread thighs as he sat on the edge of the marble. "You have seen the monster. You have seen the blood I carry. I am a warlord. I am a killer. If you stay in this cage with me, I will never ever let you out." "I don't want out," she answered fiercely, her hands coming up to cup his face. Her fingers tangled in his damp, dark hair, feeling the frantic hammering pulse at his temple. "I chose you, Minho, before the guns, before the blood. I chose you when I shattered that plate. I am not afraid of the dark, and I am not afraid of you." A sound tore from Minho's throat, a raw, desperate groan that sounded like a dying man taking his first breath of oxygen. He hauled her up onto the marble island. The collision of their bodies was violent, electric, and utterly devastating. Minho's mouth crashed down onto hers, clamping her lips with a bruising, desperate necessity. The kiss tasted of rain, salt, and the intoxicating fire of survival. Nia gasped, her mouth opening to his, and the wolf inside him roared in triumph, sweeping his tongue inside to conquer and claim every inch of her. She wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him impossibly closer. The heat of him was scorching, burning away the last remnants of her hesitation. Minho's large hands frantically tore at the buttons of her chef's coat, stripping the heavy fabric from her shoulders and tossing it to the floor. He was a man starving, and she was the feast he had been denied his entire life. His mouth left her lips, blazing a trail of wet, open-mouthed kisses down her jawline to the sensitive column of her throat. He inhaled deeply, his nose pressing against her pulse point, taking in the intoxicating scent of toasted spices, adrenaline, and her own slick, rising arousal. "Mine," he growled against her skin, his fangs grazing the delicate flesh of her neck in a terrifying, beautiful promise. Ne yoe yoang, my queen. Nia arched her back, her fingers digging fiercely into the heavy, scarred musculature of his shoulders, as a shock wave of pure pleasure ripped through her. The kitchen was a battlefield of sensory overload. Her back was pressed against the cold, hard marble of the island. Beside her, a heavy glass jar of deep red paprika and toasted cumin had been knocked over in the frantic scramble. Spilling across the stone, filling the air with the earthy, exotic heat of her grandmother's kitchen. Beneath them on the floor lay the shattered porcelain of the old world, the ruined dinner that had almost ended them both. And wrapped around her, inside her, was the most dangerous man in the city, holding on to her as if she were the only thing tethering his soul to the earth. When they finally came together, there was no gentle, tentative exploration. It was a collision of fire and gravity. It was rough, urgent, and consuming. Minho drove into her with a deep, breathless thrust that made Nia cry out, her nails scoring half-moons into his back. The pain of his wounds was entirely forgotten, eclipsed by the sheer overwhelming agony of the pleasure tearing through his veins. He anchored her hips, his golden eyes locking onto hers as he moved inside her with a relentless, punishing rhythm. They didn't make love. They waged war on the loneliness that had defined both of their lives. They tore down the walls, the paranoia and the fear, replacing it with a permanent, unbreakable bond forged in blood and spice. As the storm raged on outside the glass, Kang Minho broke apart inside the arms of his chef, burying his face in her neck as a shattering, violently powerful climax ripped through them both, binding their souls together in the beautiful, chaotic ruins of the kitchen of broken knives. When the pale grey light of dawn finally broke through the storm clouds, filtering through the massive windows of the penthouse, Nia woke to the sensation of cold, empty space beside her in the massive bed. She sat up, pulling the heavy Egyptian cotton sheets over her bare breasts. Her body ached in a dozen different exquisite ways, a visceral reminder of the hours they had spent consuming each other in the darkness. She looked toward the doorway. Minho stood at the foot of the bed. He was fully dressed. He wore a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark silk tie. The brutal feral lover from the kitchen island was gone. Meticulously locked away behind the impenetrable armor of the Syndicate Alpha, his face was a mask of cold, unreadable stoicism. But his golden eyes were dim, heavy with an agonizing, silent grief. "Minho," Nia whispered, her voice husky with sleep and confusion. He didn't move toward her. He stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from ice. "Your father is currently airspace over the Pacific," Minho stated, his voice completely devoid of inflection. He will land in Zurich in 6 hours. His debts are paid. His new life is funded. I know, Nia said softly, a nod of dread beginning to form in her stomach. You told me. I also told you who I am, Minho continued, his tone dropping into a hollow, deadened register. I am a warlord. I live in a world of violence, blood, and paranoia. The Bratva are gone. But there will be others. There will always be others looking to take the crown, looking for a weakness to exploit. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out 3 items and walked over to the heavy mahogany dresser beside the bed, setting them down with deliberate, painful slowness. I am a monster, Nia, he whispered, finally turning to look at her, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the absolute devastation, tearing his soul apart. And I refuse to watch you turn into one to survive beside me. I refuse to watch the light in you die in this fortress. Nia looked at the dresser. Sitting on the polished wood was a brand new navy blue passport with her photograph, but a different name. Beside it sat a heavy black canvas duffel bag. And resting on top of the bag was a solid tungsten key card, the master key to the penthouse elevators. There is $10 million in untraceable bearer bonds in that bag, Minho said, his voice tightening, rough with the effort it took to speak the words. The passport is fully authenticated. The key card overrides the security lockdown. The enforcers have been ordered to let you pass. Nia stared at the items, her heart breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces. He was giving her everything. He had saved her father. He had paid off the debts. And now he was giving her freedom. He was tearing out his own heart, denying his wolf its mate, because he truly believed his darkness would eventually destroy her. I have a meeting with the inner circle to restructure the territories, Minho said, turning his back on her before she could see the golden tears burning in his eyes. I will return at 8 Bugast tonight. If you are gone, I will not come looking for you. You have my word. You are free. He walked out of the bedroom, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him with a terrifying finality. For Kang Minho, the day was a grueling exercise in self-inflicted torture. He sat at the head of a massive boardroom table in the heart of the financial district, surrounded by the deadliest men in the Korean underworld. He carved up the Brata territories, reassigned lieutenants, and issued orders that would shape the criminal landscape of the city for the next decade. He was ruthless. He was terrifying. He was the undisputed alpha. And he was entirely, utterly hollow. Every time he closed his eyes, he smelled toasted cumin and sweet caramelized soy. He felt the phantom heat of her hands pressing against his bleeding side. He heard the defiant, beautiful sound of her voice, telling him she wasn't afraid of the dark. By the time 7:30 rolled around, the beast inside his chest was howling in agony. He had let her go. He had done the right thing. He had saved her from himself. But the cost was an eternity of suffocating, unbearable emptiness. At exactly 8 Anas, Minho's armored SUV pulled into the subterranean garage of his building. He rode the private elevator up to the penthouse in total silence, his hands resting on the grip of the pistol at his hip, bracing himself for the silence of an empty tomb. The elevator chimed. The brushed steel doors slid open. Minho stepped into the foyer and stopped dead in his tracks. The penthouse wasn't dark. It wasn't silent. The soft golden glow of the recessed lighting washed over the hardwood floors. And the smell. God, the smell. The air was heavy, rich, and utterly intoxicating. It smelled of sizzling garlic, fresh ginger, the deep, earthy warmth of wild mushrooms, and the undeniable, beautiful scent of home. Minho's heart stopped beating in his chest. His wolf slammed against his ribs, frantic, clawing, and desperate. He dropped his briefcase, the leather hitting the floor with a loud slap, and he practically ran down the long hallway toward the kitchen. He skidded to a halt in the archway. The marble floors had been scrubbed entirely clean of the blood and shattered porcelain. The massive island was wiped down and pristine. Standing by the 6-burner stove, a wooden spoon in her hand, was Naya. She hadn't run. She hadn't taken the passport or the $10 million. She was barefoot, her hair pulled up into a messy, careless knot on top of her head and draped over her slender frame. The cuffs rolled up to her elbows, and the hem falling just above her mid-thigh was one of his crisp, oversized white dress shirts. She turned around as he entered, her dark eyes locking onto his. There was no hesitation in her gaze. There was no fear. There was only the calm, absolute certainty of a woman who had staked her claim on her territory. Minho couldn't speak. The ruthless syndicate boss, the man who had ordered the execution of 30 men without blinking the night before, stood paralyzed in the doorway, completely disarmed by the sight of the woman in his shirt. Nia picked up a heavy, deep ceramic bowl from the counter. She turned off the burner and walked gracefully across the kitchen, stepping up to the marble island. Minho slowly walked toward her, moving as if approaching a mirage that might vanish if he breathed too heavily. He stopped on the opposite side of the marble, his golden eyes wide, tracking her every movement. Nia set the bowl down on the counter and slid it across the smooth stone. It came to a stop directly in front of him. It was a simple, perfect bowl of steaming, spicy oxtail stew, the very first dish she had ever made for him. The dish that had shattered his icy exterior and brought him back to life. She looked up, meeting the burning, incredulous stare of the deadliest man in the city. She placed both of her hands flat on the marble countertop, leaning forward just a fraction of an inch, commanding the space, commanding him. I tore up the passport. Minho, Nia said, her voice steady, powerful, and ringing with absolute finality. I am not running. I am not hiding. And I am definitely not your chef anymore. She reached across the island, her fingers curling into his dark silk tie, pulling him down until his face was inches from hers, his breath hitching as he stared into the eyes of his mate. "Sit down," she whispered, her lips brushing against his in a promise of 1,000 fiery nights to come and eat. She was no longer a captive. She was no longer an employee. She was the anchor to his beast, the fire in his blood, and the undisputed queen of his empire. And Kang Minho, the apex predator of the soul underworld, surrendered to her completely. And that is how you tame a mafia wolf. I hope you enjoyed this short story. If you love the intense, high-stakes dynamic between these two, you are going to be obsessed with my upcoming exclusive full-length movie, Married to the Most Feared Korean Mafia Boss. It has the same dark tension, fierce romance, and ruthless underworld vibes. Click the link in the description or the pinned comment right now to join the waitlist, and I'll notify you the second it drops. Also, if you want to support my channel and help me keep bringing these dark romances to life, you'll find a link to leave a tip down there as well. Thank you so much for your support, and I'll see you in the next